This video is a review of Chapter 5, Listening and Responding. Well, before we start, we need to understand that we listen 45% of the time. It's almost half the time that we communicate. Now we need to look at what is the importance of listening and responding. Well, number one, it establishes relationships with people. It creates good understanding. And it prevents problems such as misunderstanding. And because of that, it saves time and it leads to better work results. Now, they call that work synergy. That means people are working together without misunderstanding. Now, we need to look at listening and hearing. Is there a difference? Well, the first difference is that hearing is automatic. It just happens. It's natural. It's also passive. We don't have to think about it. And finally, when we are hearing, we can be distracted by our own thoughts. Listening, on the other hand, is very active. We have to think about it. We ask questions when we are listening because, point number 3, we are paying attention to the speaker. That means it's a higher mental process. Now, there are 5 activities involved in listening. So number 1 is we selecting. We are focusing on the speaker. We're choosing who to listen to. And then we're attending, and that means we pay attention or focus on the message. Third step is understanding, trying to make sense of what you hear. Fourth step is remembering, to remember what you've heard. And the final step is responding, and that is answering or asking a question. Now, when we are listening, there are a number of barriers to listening, things that get in the way. The first one is internal barriers. It's within the person. And the second is information processing barriers. We'll look at that in a further slide. And the final one is context barriers. In other words, the place and the time and noise around you. For example, when you're in the mall, it's difficult to listen. So we're going to look firstly at internal barriers. Well, the first barrier is comparing. When you compare yourself and what you know to what other people are saying, it shuts down the listening process. Secondly is mind reading, trying to guess what the other person is actually saying or thinking. And the third one is a very bad one, and that's judging, deciding who's good and who's bad, who's right and who's wrong. And that's kind of shuts down listening quite a lot. We see a lot of that in social media. The fourth one is advising. That's not really listening because you want to tell the person what you think. The fourth one is when we are tired, we're listening for a long time, we tend to daydream. And then we move on to filtering. And that's when you filter things through your own understanding rather than trying to listen to what the other person says. So you filter only what you agree with. And finally, we get rehearsing, and that is practicing in your mind your answer so you're not actually listening. Now, number 2, we need to look at information processing barriers. So look at those 2 words, information processing, how we deal with information. And firstly it's the rate. So when someone speaks very fast or we get lots of information in a short period of time, we struggle to listen. And that goes into the second point, information overload. That's just too much information coming at us. Sometimes we need to stop and we need to focus and just listen. Then we get context barriers. Well, this one's very easy because it's about where and when you are listening. So if there's noise, if there's busyness, that will prevent you from listening. Then we move on to responding skills. Well, for the final exam, just read through these because these are important when you are, for example, in a job interview. How do you respond? Now, what's very important is the 4 steps in listening and responding. So step number 1 is make sure you are listening actively. In other words, you're paying attention. Second, listen and respond with empathy, trying to understand what the other person is meaning or saying. And the third one is listening and responding with openness. In other words, not being judgmental, not trying to give them advice, going back to our barriers. And of course, the last one is listening with an awareness of non-verbal communication, looking at body language. These 4 steps are very important. I'm going to pause the slide here and I'll continue with a second video on Chapter 5.